G'day and welcome to the channel. I'm here with Ken Foletta and I want to introduce a new segment we're going to be doing today called Dream Jobs. Now Ken has been very patient with me and I've got to thank Ken for being our first dream job on the show. And we're going to talk with him a little bit about how he got into being a designer for one of the major car companies here in Australia. Ken, welcome.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, I studied industrial design at RMIT. I had a teenage passion for cars, of course. I'd been drawing cars every spare moment of my life instead of doing homework and things like that. And even though at RMIT they didn't really encourage automotive thinking, the guy in charge was a super greenie. But nevertheless, when I heard one of the night students there said, he passed the word around that they were looking for designers at Holden, I thought, well, I'll try it out. And I went down and did the interview. I didn't have a lot of car drawings with me, but they liked the presentation of the work that I took down, and I got a job in interiors pretty well straight away. So I was working within a couple of weeks of finishing my exams. Yeah.
Wow, that's a pretty big step for. I mean, I know today that must be a fairly cutthroat industry, and even back then it must have been literally a dream job to walk straight out of your course straight into something like that. Working with a company like Holden on interiors, tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah,
I mean,
okay.
You rock up day one on the job.
Yeah, first day was amazing. I had a draftsman tell me what to do. I was laying out the dielectric lines on a Tirana seat when I just thought, oh hell, this can't be off to a good start. And you'd look around the walls, and John Zarrella was the chief designer there at the time, and John was an amazing illustrator. As you walk down the hall, he had a parade of about 10 giant illustrations that he'd done, and they were just amazing. So I just sort of thought, well, sooner or later I'm going to have to learn to draw like that. And designers are very competitive. They don't always tell each other what they're thinking, especially. So my first task was to work out how to draw decent drawings. You didn't really learn how to do renderings at RMIT. It was more about design and thinking and problem solving and coming up with creative solutions. All that sort of stuff was terrific. But presentation, the guys the designers at Holden, especially the Americans that they had working there, really knew how to do it.
Yeah. So the processes. I mean, we're not talking today's materials. We're talking at a time where computers were still very much in their infancy, if at all. So explain, I guess, a little bit. I mean, I'm fortunate enough. I've known you for a few years now that we've had this conversation before. But tell me a little bit about the materials and the process of what you had to do. I mean, it wasn't all computer based.
Well, everything was done on paper. You had to, of course, you had to have ideas, and you would sketch them in either ballpoint or pencil or something like that, and then you would enlarge them and do a big rendering. Markers, the fluid markers were basically where you'd start. You used ellipse guides and curves. You would use those as aids to get your shapes. And you had special paper that you'd draw on one side and you'd get the solid colour. If you turned the paper over, you'd get half that colour on the back. Okay. So that was pretty much the way you went from a full colour to a half colour. And then for the in-between tones, you'd use, and the soft effect, you'd use pastel. And you'd use pastel on a little pad, and sometimes you'd have to cut out a template so you wouldn't get it in the wrong places because it wasn't very accurate. You'd wipe it with this pastel, and you could put blue if you wanted something to go back, or red if you wanted something to come forward, or glass. You'd put a bit of sky, a bit of blue on the glass, and that's the way you'd get your effect.
So do you think, in today's modern age, that those knowing about those colours must still be important.
There's a lot of drawing basics that that modern computers have emulated. I'm sure you could probably do equivalents in Photoshop. In Photoshop, you've got airbrushes and you've got markers. You've got all sorts of lines available in Photoshop, and you've got fills, instant fills, and of course you wouldn't have any of the problems with the overlap of lines and things like that you used to have. But and of course you'd spray. You'd then have to fix it all with spray. The smell in design stuff was really quite unusual. All these chemicals and everything that was using, to fix their drawings, and even the inks that you would use had a strong smell. And I notice now that a lot of those inks are not available anymore. Probably because they don't do you much good.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's go back to Holden. You're there. You've started this dream job in terms of doing the design work. What were some of your first projects that you were working on, and some of the things that are most memorable to you as you started to find your feet and work with Holden?
Well, I think the first one that struck me was the HT dome lamp. We had the Holden had a great big old-fashioned dome lamp with lots of lenses, Fresnel effects moulded into it, and they wanted something more contemporary for the HT. The HK had just been released about the week I started there. The HT was pretty well finished. We hadn't started on the HQ yet, that was coming, but they wanted this more contemporary dome lamp for the HT, and I did a fairly simple little thing, and it was quite small, and the engineer was furious. He said it wouldn't fit. I'd missed it by 1/8 of an inch, and I said, well, if you move it 1/8 of an inch off centre of the car, it'll fit. It did. So he ended up happy to do that, and that lighting engineer ended up at Hella as one of their main engineers. So that was the first job. But being in interiors, you can do seats and instrument panels and things like that, but they're not quite as impressive as the outside of the car. So I was quietly working on the techniques that the guys in the exterior studios were doing. And, I've even still got one of those on the wall here that I did, I think, in my first year there. And that went up at the entrance. The chief, Paul Tatsis, put that up at the entrance of the studio. That was...
He obviously, saw that shot and was pretty impressed.
Yeah, Paul showed me a couple of tricks to help me get it looking the way it did. Yeah.
So was that you heading towards exteriors? Is that something you wanted to do, or
not
just
really.
something that you had a passion
Not really.
for?
No. As you move, when we did the HQ, that was everything. The whole car was designed in Australia. Okay, it might have been designed by Americans, some of it. There was the A-body, the American, the GTO and the Chevelle and all that were a strong influence in the way the car was engineered. But it had to all be done here. And the local design rules meant that things had to be done in Australia that weren't required elsewhere in the world. Some of the standards. And so we really had to do a lot of interesting things. One of them was the HQ pillar. Is so slim. I mean, it's really quite a thick pillar, but it points away from the driver so that when you look past it appears narrow and gives you terrific vision. That was one thing that we did. And of course it was designed for impact without, the seatbelt legislation hadn't been approved. So the whole thing, you had to be able to have a crash at speed and survive. So the pad was very thick and deep. And we later on in the HJ were able to do that. But as you work your way up in the design team, the jobs become more responsible. See, when I first started, I was doing door trims and steering wheels, armrests, things like that. The chief designer was basically doing the instrument panel, and I'd be doing the gauges and little things like that, that more or less to help him. And then as you work your way up, by the time you become a senior or assistant chief designer, you're pretty well doing the whole car yourself.
Okay.
Yeah.
So while you were in that process of coming up through the ranks, I know one of the things I was most impressed with is your steering wheel design.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about your steering wheel design. We've got it here behind us. Yeah. Give us some background on that, some thoughts that went into that, and a little bit of history on how and where that went to.
Yeah. Well, we started off the very first one, which you can't see was a fully padded version. We were worried about the Australian design rules said you had to have 1.5 inches of crush, and the thing had to progressively crumple and things like that. Then we saw that Pontiac was playing with a Momo wheel, which is an Italian, a little flat wheel with aluminium spokes and things like that, and that looked terrific. So we wanted, Leo Pruno was the design director, he'd just come over from America. He said, well, I want you to do something like this. So that's where we started. But the engineer insisted on steel spokes. Initially we had a very deep crash pad. It probably wouldn't look good, wouldn't look so deep today because the airbags have huge pads in the middle. But in those days, most of your steering wheels just had tiny little boss in the middle. So that had to be engineered, designed for safety. And the other thing was the thick steering wheel rim. We learnt at Tech, we learnt at school that human engineering was very important and certain things mattered. And one of them was if you have a tight grip, your fingers will get tired. So we made the steering wheel quite thick. The rim, I was a little bit worried about that because it was so thick I thought people might actually complain. A lot of people didn't like you stepping too far away from what they'd been doing.
Used to,
yeah. But that worked out really well. Now the engineer insisted on steel spokes because he liked the control that he had. Steel is a very predictable material.
Yes.
So yes, we had to do steel spokes. But look, in the end, I don't think it mattered that much. The wheel added character to the car, and we were able to do various horn bars. We had a little horn bar at first, and then Pat Fury, the American designer who came over for the HJ, he did a fairly neat little button which saw it through to the HZ.
Okay. So across quite a few models then?
Yeah, my word. Yeah. Oh yeah. No, that lasted from HQ to WB, that steering wheel.
Fantastic.
So, and imparted a good character to the car.
Oh, it's a good classic looking wheel, so it was great.
Yeah.
So you've done the wheel, you're moving up through the ranks. I know we were talking about colours before and how important they are. You did some colour range work?
Oh yeah. That's perhaps a little bit later. Let's just mention, Steve, the instrument panel that we did for the HJ, which was, when we did the HQ, everything was the same plastic moulding. We just changed a few finishes and things. We realised that all the cars were a little bit too close. So for the HJ, one of the program briefs was we'd have a Kingswood that looked like a Kingswood, a Monaro that looked like a sports car, and a DeVille that looked like a luxury car. So using the same crash pad, just changing the plastic of the instrument cluster behind the steering wheel, we did a long horizontal thing for the Kingswood, and we did the sports cluster for the GTS. We had full instrumentation. So we had the 4 gauges, the tacho and speedo, and we had a clock in the middle. That was contentious. The clock was contentious. It wasn't in the product program.
Okay.
The engineers go berserk when anything isn't on the product program because that's their job description. That's their job list. They work to that, But Bill DeLong, who was the finance director, I don't know whether he had a sense of humour or what, but he also had an understanding of what some things meant. He said, we cannot say this car's got full instrumentation if it doesn't have a clock. So,
Yeah,
so,
fair enough.
so out went the dummy clock, and in came a real clock in the middle. So, yes, and I've stayed there ever since. Yeah. So, and then we did a square apertures, similar mechanics, I suppose. Square apertures with wood grain for the DeVille and later on the Caprice.
Okay. Yeah. See, that would have been the clock. I know, modern days where you could laugh with the Land Cruiser boys that depending on which model you get, the lower down models don't actually come with a clock.
Yeah,
you need to get to the GXL to get a clock.
Yeah, that's right.
So you laugh about what the cost of that, what that add-on's worth.
Yeah.
But, so that then, with that instrument work, is that one of the trips you did away? Was that part of that testing of that instrument?
Oh no, that came later.
Much later.
With the electronic cluster. Yeah, that was a whole new field when we started working on computers, trip computers and things like that. Yeah.
So computers in the car in terms of
yeah. That took a long time to happen. Yeah.
And how did that impact with the design in terms of, was that fixed in terms of shape and size and you had to try and make that work, or did you get some control over designing what that electronic component was going to look like and how it was going to work in with what you were doing?
It was pretty much a group project with engineering. Nobody, when we first started putting computers in cars, especially the ones that relate to the driver, nobody had done it before, and we didn't really know what the other people in the world were doing. They were probably working in parallel to us, but nobody had come up with any answers for this sort of stuff. The most difficult thing for the engineers was to work out a fuel gauge that worked, a fuel consumption thing that worked out how much fuel you were using. They could measure everything else. So once they'd solved that problem, we could do distance to empty, average economy and all those sort of things. So designing an instrument with that sort of thing was pretty radical stuff, you know. We had speed, fuel, how much fuel, to go from that to something that starts to tell you useful information was a huge step.
Well, I mean today, with fuel injection, we know exactly how much fuel we're using. But back then, with in a carb environment, there must have been a fair effort for the engineers to work out just sort of what fuel we were using.
Yeah, the ultimate version of that was in the VK when we did a fully electronic instrument cluster. And looking back, we might have even gone a bit far. We probably didn't have a big enough crew, but we were very ambitious. That instrument cluster displayed everything. We had we had the speedo and the tacho were the full graphic display, and we had numbers as well. So not only did your speedo show you that it was full house, full speed, but it also had the numbers, so you knew exactly what you were doing as well. So all that sort of thing. And unfortunately, the fact that it was so complex and all that, they didn't continue with it in the next model, which was a bit of a shame. But I really felt at that stage with the VK, people were not buying Hondas, but buying Commodore SLEs because they were in the front line of creative cars,
that interior that was looking at them was state of the art.
Yeah, my word, yeah. So it's probably a bit of a shame we had to retreat from that, but all good in the end.
Do you think that there was any sort of marketing, pushback on that? It was perhaps too radical and too early, in terms of the market being able to provide you some sort of feedback and saying, well, look, while you're getting that higher end that wanted that were coming across from Hondas and things like that, your core market perhaps was a little...
I'm not so sure that, no, I don't really think so. I think there might have been a few people who thought, look, I don't really need all this, but I don't think it put anybody off. The thing was, I believe, even though they worked out a changeover, thing was reliability and a few issues like that. It was a very complex piece of electronics.
Okay.
In the days when, perhaps we weren't quite ready for that level of complexity.
Well, you talk about reliability, and I know we've talked about one of the trips you went away on before. You did a pretty amazing testing trip.
Yeah.
So now this seems fairly different to the way things are done now. I mean, I don't think they take design crews away on testing trips these days, but obviously back then it was a little bit different. So
well, the VK had a lot of new things on it. It had a new air conditioner. It had the electronic fuel injection engine, the 6-cylinder electronic fuel injection. That was the first year for that. It had the electronic cluster. It had a lot of new stuff, and the engineers arranged this huge test trip. They had about 4 or 5 vehicles. They went right all the way around Australia. So even though it wasn't my responsibility, it's more or less an engineer is the one who has to prove things out. Because I was so personally involved with the development of this cluster, we'd had quite a few sort of, not boardroom battles, but sort of behind the boardroom battles to get this thing happening. And so I went on the trip where it was evaluated in real life. And, for example, one thing that we don't even think of now, we've got phones and everything that make all these interesting little sounds. We wanted to make, we had these warnings for low coolant and low this and hot that and all that sort of thing, door ajar and all that sort of thing. But there were no buzzers there were no chimes available. We ended up having to use something that sounded like a damn door buzzer, because you just could not buy little speakers that made lovely little tweeting sounds. They didn't exist, and of course now they're commonplace. So so on the test trip, they had a bit of a problem with the low coolant sensor, and the thing kept going.
Your traditional door buzzer. Yep.
Yeah. So, and anyhow, that all got worked out in the end, but that was just one thing. Yeah. A
little bit of those, the scenario where the technology you want isn't quite available for what you're designing.
Exactly. Yeah. We were right at the front line. We were on the breaking wave, I suppose you could say, of technology at that stage. Yeah.
And we were talking a little bit about this earlier off camera, in terms of materials as well. I mean, the materials that are available to designers today, from a production point of view, that just weren't available back then.
Yeah.
Your limitations on design had to be limited to the materials and the engineering ability to work with those materials.
Oh my word! And LEDs, for example, we had LEDs in the radio, and they were so weak. They were so weak you could hardly see them. But they were obviously the coming thing, and they were very simple and they worked very efficiently, but you just really couldn't get them bright enough in daylight. So we tried all sorts of things to mean that you could see them, but they only just worked. And of course now LEDs are so bright you've got to... Yeah.
So let's bring, I guess, that that evolution of process. You become the designer, the chief designer.
Yeah, I was made chief designer in 1978 when Pat Fury, who was an American, got sent back home. Or he went back home.
Yep.
And I stayed chief designer until 1983 of interiors, where I went into exteriors, where we were doing the VN, and I had a lot to do with the Calais and the station wagon, a little bit to do with the station wagon.
So tell me, with that evolution from interiors to exteriors, was there anything there in exteriors that we're thinking back that you kind of, I know we talk about steering wheels and your colour boards that you did with interiors. Was there a moment for you thinking back where with the exteriors that you really feel that you've made a contribution to Holden and those cars going forward?
Oh, I think so. Yeah, the work I did on the VN Calais, a lot of that was held over for when they did the Statesman. The grille and all of that. So even though the Statesman didn't come out quite how I would have done it, I know my word. But
So in terms of dream jobs, I mean that's that classic. If you work hard enough and you do what's required and you've got the talent, you can actually go straight out of your dream job.
Yeah, you can. And the tech colleges now are getting the people a lot closer to being employable than they were. I didn't really have a clue how to do a proper. I just used to do all my drawings of cars with ballpoint pen on just a spare page in my school notebook, but when you start doing serious stuff there, you learn so quickly on the job. And John Zarrella, I have to say, if he saw you had a problem, he'd see you sitting there and you might be scratching your head not knowing how to put your next line on the paper. John would sit down and he would talk with you and you would work together, and you'd come up. He was such a motivator. You would feel on top of the moon. You would really feel on top of the moon. So you'd go from feeling, how in the hell do I do this, feeling black as soot, to feeling on top of the world. You'd pin this thing up on the wall, and that's where it was very competitive, because you'd be pinning it up on the wall. Other designers would be doing the same thing, and you'd want to make sure yours was the best. Yeah.
But I guess in that creative environment, being on top of the world is important from a creative point of view. I mean, if you're not feeling 100%, then it's very hard to be creative. And I know that from my own stuff at home.
Well, feeling flat can push you sometimes to doing the work that puts you on top of the world. You know what I mean?
True. Yeah. So I guess to sort of close out this new segment, any tips for people out there that want to go out and achieve their dream job? I mean, let's add some life tips to this in terms of achieving your goals. I mean, you've obviously done what back if you looked at your classroom group, there would have been so many people vying for that position. This really was an ultimate achievement.
Yeah.
What life tips can you give us for how we get out there and achieve that?
Look, drawing is still important. Drawing is still important. As you think of things, draw them, and just keep on drawing, and sort of in a way that's work. Just push yourself and just keep on drawing. You hear on TV all the time now people who say anybody can do anything. I'm afraid that's not quite true. You really do need a little bit of talent, but working on it is the main thing. Don't think because I'm skilled I can do anything. You can't. Everybody has to work on it.
Yeah, there's hard work involved.
Yeah, my word. Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks very much, Ken. It's been a pleasure to sit with you today and listen to you talk about that amazing history inside Holden, and to get, I guess, a bit of an insight into what goes on behind. I mean, we see in the magazines, and I remember growing up, you'd see all these flash cars coming through, and really didn't think too much about what was going on, but there was such an amazing amount of energy and effort behind the scenes that was making all those cars happen. And
there's a lot of love in every car you see on the road, from the guys that did it,
Well, thank you very much, Ken.
Okay.
Really appreciate you having on the show.
Thank you, Steve.
All right. Thanks everyone for hanging around with us, and we'll catch up with you with the next episode. Cheers.